Our quality of life is enhanced by experiences. Experiences like attending BrandSmart are one way to enrich both our professional and personal lives. Our experiences also influence our behavior as consumers. It's the stories that we share from experiences that have the power to persuade a decision. How do you get into the mindset of your consumer to find out what stories are important to them? Our next BrandSmart session can help us build successful relationships with our marketing work. Our presenter has described himself as an in-between, kind of like a couples therapist between clients and their customers. Here to present branding in the narrative economy, the psychology of consumer experiences, please give a warm AMA Chicago welcome to founder and CEO at Threadline, Kristian Alomá, PhD. Welcome, Kristian.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone, for just coming to this fantastic day. As I tell folks every year, this is the best conference in the marketing industry that you can attend, and it's so exciting to see so many folks from the Chicago community and beyond here. So as a little bit more to that introduction, my background, as was mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Threadline. I also recently wrote a book called Start With the Story, and that book focused on my research in academia and how the principles of narrative psychology apply to the branding and marketing world. And that's really what I want to focus on, is actually my research, more so than the business, more so than the book. My dissertation work, my academic focus was around consumer psychology, consumer identity, and a field of narrative psychology, which we'll talk about. And it is in that academic work where I started to sort of ask this question. And I've been pursuing this question for a really long time, trying to understand what a brand is. This inspired my academic journey. It inspires the work that I do on a regular basis. And what's fascinating about a question like this is that very few of us have an answer that matches the person next to us in the table. When I ask you what a brand is, most folks have a thought. If there are about 200 folks in this room, there are probably 200 perspectives on what a brand is. But it's very inconsistent. And as marketers, as advertisers, as market researchers, we talk about this constantly, but very rarely agree what we're talking about. And so in my academic journey, I tried to understand, what is it? Now, if you go to the American Marketing Association's dictionary online, they will define a brand in this way. A brand is any distinctive feature like a name, term, design, or symbol that identifies goods or services. If you're like me, that probably feels incomplete to some degree, right? It feels a bit like, I guess they're talking about logos, and that's not what a brand is, right? They're talking about taglines, they're talking about the website. But this isn't a brand, right? This is incomplete to most of us. And academics conducted some research. They reviewed hundreds of papers from the marketing and branding space in academia, in psychology, in the marketing journals, trying to sort of get down to what a brand is, trying to synthesize that down to a single definition of brand. And they landed on 12 definitions of brands, right? And so they said, well, let's talk to the experts. And they went out to the experts and they interviewed consultants and professors and practitioners to try to get them to help whittle that number from 12, maybe to 3 or 2. They ended up with 6 more definitions of what a brand is. So now we're at 18 definitions of what a brand could be. But the thing that is pretty consistent for all of us is that you will likely say, I can't fully define a brand the way my neighbor can, but I know one when I see one. Right? We all know what a brand looks like. We feel it, we sense it when there is a brand in front of us, when we see something out there that is truly sort of branding. And we talk about it in this ways, right? We talk about brands as being ones that we trust. This is in our personal lives as well as practitioners. Brands that we love, right? We have this brand love score. We measure brands this way. We talk about brand loyalty, how satisfied they are with our brand, how supported I feel by the brands in my life, right? We have this kind of language. We measure brands in this way. We talk about them being, people that are passionate about our brands, that people long for our brands when they haven't been able to access that brand, that product, that service, that they miss that experience in their lives, how committed they are. And these are relatively positive attributes, but we hear in the research negative attributes as well, right? That people are addicted to certain brands, that they can feel betrayed by certain brands. These descriptors, what's fascinating about them, though we talk about them pretty regularly in the marketing space, are also descriptors we use in social psychology to talk about relationships. And this is where the connection sort of really kind of lit up for me, is that brands are relationships. From my perspective, from the perspective of the way people think about brands and build connections to brands, a brand is a relationship between the audience and the organization. It's that thing in between, the space between, that neither your organization nor them truly own, but is defined by the relationship that you have. So you may have a product, you may have a service, but if you don't have a relationship, you do not have a brand, right? And there are some really lovely products out there that make a lot of money. But the organizations that focus on building relationships, that focus on building brands, they think about that relationship for the long term. They think about that customer's life. Not just the lifetime value, but that life that they're experiencing. And these relationships in our personal lives exist to help us sort of build structure and meaning around our world. Brand relationships do the same thing. Brands help us build structure, build meaning out of who we are, out of what we're doing, out of what's happening in our lives. And fortunately, in the psychology space, we have ways to measure relationships. What you see here is a scale that's used to measure the closeness of relationships. It's called the inclusion of the other into the self. And it's a scale that's used to try to understand how much someone else is integrated into your life, into your sense of identity. And academics will take this scale, and it typically starts with a range of 2 circles that are not at all overlapping to 2 circles that are almost completely overlapped. And one of those circles says you, and the other circle says other or a target relationship. And if you have a neighbor, right, there may be a little bit of overlap between those 2 circles. You might sort of point to that number. If you've got a significant other in your life, there's going to be a heavy overlap between these 2 circles. And this integration, this inclusion of the other in the self, helps us understand as psychologists how much someone else's identity is a part of our own identity, right? So my partner, if she experiences a success, I feel that success as if it's my own, right? And if she experiences struggle or failure, I experience those struggles and failures as if they're my own. Now, this is sort of how we think about relationships in the psychology space. And in my academic work, I wanted to find out, do we do that with brands too? And so we mapped this same exercise, but we replaced the other with brands, and we had them choose a brand in their life and map out how closely, how much do these circles overlap when you think about yourself and your relationship with one of those brands in your lives. And it turns out the same things happen. People have brands in their lives that feel tightly overlapped with who they are, right? Are you an Apple fanboy, right? Are you Nike or Adidas? Are you one grocery store versus another? There's a lot of grocery wars out there, and I know that folks have a real sort of affinity towards their grocery stores. And these brands help us sort of understand who we are. These brands are integrated with this sense of self. Ultimately, brands become part of our identities. There's the old saying, you kind of are defined by your 5 closest friends. I like to think that you could also probably be defined by the brands you consider to be your 5 favorite brands, right? What are they? What do they do? What's that brand personality like? What are they? How do they engage in the world? How do they show up in your life? And when you study brand relationships, when you study identity with individuals, you inevitably fall into the space of narrative psychology. And I promised I would talk a little bit about that. Narrative psychology, is a subfield of psychology that looks at the way we make stories to make sense of ourselves and the world around us. Every day, each one of us is crafting this narrative and revising this narrative that explains who we are, most of the time to ourselves, but also explains who we are to others. So when we focus on building and sort of understanding our sense of the world, we create stories about the world. So when we think about identity, we have to think about those narratives. We have to think about the stories that are being crafted by those brands and the stories that we're crafting because of those brands. So when we think about a product or a service, many of you probably know that framework, jobs to be done. This is a great way to think about products or services. What job can they do in someone's life? But if you want to think about a brand, I suggest a different framework. What are the stories to be told? What can that person say about themselves because they've engaged with your brand? If you're like me at the beginning of every year, You probably commit yourself to getting healthy again, maybe trying to run that 5K, maybe that half marathon if you're ambitious, maybe that full marathon if you've got problems as far as dealing with your own performance issues. But you will likely go out and purchase a whole new kit, right? You're like, well, if I'm gonna start running, I need a new pair of Nikes, I need some new gear, I need all this clothes to make me feel like I'm someone that can run, to make me feel like I am a runner. If you're in the creative space, whether or not you realize it, you may sometimes embrace things like Apple technologies or certain brands because they make you feel more creative. These brands help us tell stories about who we are. They help us define who we are. And this concept is at the heart of what I call the narrative economy. The narrative economy is this idea that you don't just buy goods and services because they fill a job. You exchange money, you exchange time, you exchange your resources for the ability to tell a story. Whether you're telling that story to yourself or you're telling that story to the world around you. And if we aren't thinking about the narrative economy as marketers, as branders, if we aren't thinking about the stories that our customers can tell because of us, we're missing out on a huge chunk of why they buy us. What stories will they be able to tell themselves because of you? This is the question that the narrative economy poses to all of us. And this is the opportunity that we have as marketers to shape those stories. And if we shape those stories in ways that are beneficial, that are productive, that are profitable to both our consumers and ourselves, we become part of their identity. And there's two ways I recommend doing this, two ways that you can go about becoming a part of that story, helping shape those stories. And the first one is to understand your audience's story. And I don't just mean conduct surveys, send that out. I mean actually talk to them and understand who they are. Stories that they might tell that have nothing to do with your brand, but that your brand sits in. Your brand lives in that space. If you're in the space of providing microwavable meals, you should understand what dinner means to them, right? What stories do they tell about family time? What stories do they tell about sharing and breaking bread? And then where does your brand fit into that? Dan McAdams, who's one of the lead thinkers in narrative psychology and an academic at Northwestern University, says, if you want to know me, then you must know my story, for my story defines who I am. So when you go to understand your audience, I ask you to push beyond demographics, to understand who is the hero of that story, and how do they position themselves in that story. Are they victims? Are they sidekicks? Are they survivors? Are they someone that's looking to defeat sort of a monster, or someone that's looking to accomplish great things and climb that peak or finish that marathon? What is their goal? What are they working towards? And how does your brand fit into that? And then what are they doing in that story? All stories essentially have those three core components. And if we understand that about our customers, both at the individual level and at large, we more clearly understand what's happening in their lives, how they're making sense of their experience, how they're making sense of the choices that they make. And that essentially sort of maps to what we call the context of your customer, the category of your customer, and the behavior of your customer. Context is critically important. I always suggest folks look at the context, which may not necessarily include your brand, because context helps us make sense of what's happening. If I ask everyone here to raise your hand if you think it's a good idea to jump out of a speeding car, most of you would not, I hope, raise your hand. But if I told you that car's brakes were broken and it's approaching a cliff, suddenly jumping out seems like the best idea. Because when the context changes, the meaning of the behavior changes. So we need to understand their context, the context of their story. And then when we understand how they engage with the category, we understand the way they make sense of what options are available to them, the behaviors that they choose to do. And then when we understand the behavior within that story, we understand their relationship to us. Why are they choosing us as an individual? Step two, to really sort of doing this right, is to find your role in the audience's story. And it essentially sort of maps against that first step. Figure out where you fit into their story. Nora Ephron, who's the famous and late writer of When Harry Met Sally, You've Got Mail, some of those classics, she said, if you don't create your own stories, someone else will do it for you. They are narrative machines. Consumers, all of us, create narratives constantly. If you're not giving them or fitting into that narrative, they will put you somewhere in that narrative that you may not necessarily want, or they will create narratives about you that you don't necessarily want. So we have to ask ourselves, how can we shape that story? Can you transform the hero in some way? Do you give them magic powers? Do you give them new tools and resources? Do you give them skills and concepts that they can apply to their problem? How can you help them realize goals that they maybe hadn't thought of? You're there certainly to help them accomplish that base goal, but is there more that they could do, more that they could think about, that you're helping them realize? How can you make whatever they're doing easier, right? How do you reduce or remove those barriers? How do you help them do that faster or more efficiently? And then can you make the outcome or the reward of their story more rewarding or perhaps less painful? Can you amplify the happy ending so that it's even happier? If you do these things, you will start to find yourself not just serving them, but integrating into their sense of self, integrating into their identity. One important thing I tell folks all the time when going through this process, and this is the biggest mistake most brands make, is to remember that when you focus on those stories, your brand is not the hero. This is critically important because from a psychological perspective, if they are engaging with a story that has a hero, there's no space for them to be the hero. And we see brands do this all the time. Brands that focus on themselves, focus on what they do, focus on the transformations that they create, rather than the transformations that they allow, the transformations that they enable, the transformations that they support. By playing sidekick, support, by focusing on how you can make your consumer the hero, you allow space for them to embrace that story. I want to share a personal story, and I don't know if any of our McDonald's friends are still in the crowd because it's about McDonald's. When people ask me what my favorite restaurant in the world is, I inevitably and always tell them McDonald's. And I have traveled to wonderful restaurants all over the world, and McDonald's is still absolutely my favorite. And the reason why isn't necessarily because I think their food is better than that Michelin-starred chef in France, though their burgers are delicious and the fries are amazing. It's because as a child, every Saturday, my grandparents took me from my parents, who were working 2 jobs, to McDonald's to give my parents a break. Myself and my brothers. Every Saturday we went to McDonald's. On the way there, we learned Spanish. I basically grew up in McDonald's. I remember having first the Happy Meals and then graduating to a regular cheeseburger and then the Big Mac when I became an adult, right? And then we would play on the play place. We'd drive home, we'd learn more Spanish, and then we'd spend the day or the evening at my grandparents' house watching Golden Girls and Empty Nest. It was the best, right? McDonald's didn't just feed me. McDonald's is at the heart of one of the relationships that I hold most dear, the relationships with my grandparents. It created an environment where we could connect, where we could be a family, where we could have this connection across generations and serve all of us. And McDonald's most likely maybe didn't realize it at the time, but they know it now, and they've redesigned their stores to be more family friendly, right? And this is at a point where you see other brands produce things that look like kings that I think look like creepy uncles. Those aren't family-friendly restaurants, right? That isn't where the parent wants to take their kid to the creepy uncle wearing a crown. They want to take their family to the place that has the happy clown and the play place, right? And the thing is that when you step back and let your consumer be the hero of that story, something really interesting happens. Hero's paradox is that by stepping back and letting them be the hero, you can become the hero to them. But you can't assume that role. You have to give them the space so that you can be a hero in their lives. So when we say the opportunity is to ask yourself, what stories can your customers tell themselves because of you? I also want to remind you that this is a responsibility. What stories are they telling because of you, and are you proud of those stories? We heard today earlier about the responsible use of AI. We'll likely continue to hear about the ethical role that we play in people's lives, how we make them feel, right? Do we make them feel ugly so they buy makeup, or do we make them feel confident because they feel like they're their true selves? What stories are they telling because of you? This is the sort of responsibility we have as marketers. And in this room, I believe, and I know from my research, that the greatest sort of power in the world, the greatest impact on people's emotional, mental, social health comes from the individuals and the decisions that you make in this space. You spend more time with people than their doctors, than their family members, than most of their best friends. You're in their pockets, you're at every meal, you're there providing some of the critical services that they need, and it's because of you, their emotions, their psychology, their mental health can either be brought up and sort of they can be made to feel the hero of their stories, or they can be made to feel as though they're playing a second bit in that story. So I ask all of you as part of that, as recognizing the role that you play, to commit to that responsibility, to recognize you all play a fantastic role in their stories and you can help shape them for the better. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristian. I'm sure we've got some great questions. Josh, what's our first question?
Okay, we have a few. So the first is, what indicators do you recommend brands mine in order to get to the heart of the customer story?
Sorry, what indicators do you recommend brands what?
Mine.
You know, it's oftentimes a couple of different sort of tools allow you to understand what their story is and whether you're actually playing a role in that story. Whether you're using social listening tools, traditional market research, particularly qualitative market research, to understand, are they talking about us? And then what ways are they talking about us, right? Years ago, a soda brand put out a campaign featuring Kendall Jenner. And Kendall Jenner was shooting a supermodel campaign in this commercial, and outside of her window was this protest going on, right? And the protest moves towards, and Kendall Jenner eventually sees this happening and engages with it, walks with the protest, and gets to the point where there's a line of riot officers standing there, some of the friendliest riot officers you can imagine, because this is a commercial, of course. No weapons or anything like that. And of course, at this protest, there are buckets of soda and ice everywhere, right? And so at one point, Kendall Jenner, being the model that she is, she picks up a can of soda, walks across the riot line, hands it to a riot officer, and suddenly social justice is solved, right? Now, that campaign itself wasn't necessarily a great campaign, but the feedback we heard was, that's not the role you play, right? This isn't where you fit in. You did not just usurp all the work of these folks that are doing social activism, that are working to change the world, that are working to sort of make these kinds of impacts, by claiming your soda solves it all, right? Now compare that to another soda brand who ran a campaign in South America, and during the entire campaign, which focuses on a young couple trying to have a child, the soda is on the side, right? It's at the table, but it's not at the center. The soda didn't impregnate anyone, right? It was the family and their relationship, and the soda was there as just part of the celebration. And you hear folks talk about that campaign about, oh, I remember when my grandfather would take me out, and that would be a treat to get this soda, right? Or I remember this being a part of every meal, and there's just rows of 2 liters of this soda at every party, things like that. You can see how you relate into that story, and you can understand, are we relating in a way where we're integrated into that identity, or in a way where we feel as though we're tearing that story down?
That's great. So how should brands that live in commoditized or low engagement categories think about leveraging the power of relationships in their work?
That's a fantastic question, and in some of my work, what I've done is scaled the kinds of relationships that you can have, right? And in all of our personal lives, we have, of course, those relationships with our partners or our best friends, and then we have really wonderful relationships with our neighbors that aren't necessarily very close. One of the things that you should do is to assess where on that scale do you fit, and how much permission do you have from your consumer to go deeper, right? There are successful brands across that whole spectrum. But if you can move even one category closer from what I would call, let's say, the familiar stranger, where they know you, but they don't really know you. They've seen you walking your dog during the pandemic, but they never actually talked to you, right? To the platonic soulmate. That's like the scale that you can have. But there are about 7 or 8 categories in between, and if you can move up one more category, you can see 10, 20% increase in engagement, in loyalty, in response. You don't have to become, if you're a chip brand, you're not necessarily at the heart of their relationship with their significant other, but you can be at the part of their celebrations, which may be as a friend, right? And that's a successful relationship for you. If you can go deeper than that, fantastic, right? Some things like phones are part of our lives all the time. We're using them quite frequently. So they have an opportunity to be deeper. But if you are canned beans, you might just be at that first, third, or fourth level, but you have a really wonderful relationship with them and a relationship that is appropriate for that consumer.
That's great. We have one more question. So what recommendations do you have for getting non-brand executives like CFOs or CEOs to believe in the power of brand and brand experience to grow the business?
Sorry, say that question again?
Yep. What recommendations do you have for getting non-brand executives, like a CFO or a CEO, to believe in the power of brand or brand experience and relationships to grow the business?
Yeah, you know, when it comes to storytelling, one of the sort of universal golden rules is know your audience, right? Your CFO may want the data on all of that. Show them the data, right? Studies from Edelman and others show that brands that have a tighter, more trusted, more loyal relationship tend to perform better than the Fortune 500 or even the Fortune 50 overall in the stock exchange. Research shows that when you build a tighter relationship, customers tend to be more loyal, they tend to purchase again, and they tend to spend more overall. So you can start by showing them the data, of course. They're going to need to believe that. But also show them the customers. So much of our organization, this is an interesting sort of space that you all live in as marketers, is you live in this liminal space between the inside of the organization and the outside of the organization, right? That is a really wonderful space to be, but you can also be seen as the heretic within your organization, the one who introduces ideas that they're like, that's not the way we do things, and you're like, well, this is what the customers want, right? This is what they're asking for. This is what will serve their needs. So often, the problem is those folks on the inside, they're crunching numbers, they're producing a product, they're designing the website, but they're not necessarily talking to customers. It is so powerful sometimes when you can bring that customer into the organization, whether you actually bring one in or through research, you represent them, you show them clips, you show them quotes about what you're hearing from those customers, because they sometimes don't realize those customers are people too. And they have so much in common with those customers that once you start to do that, you start to build that sense of empathy with them. You start to build a relationship between the CFO and the individual that they're connecting with. But again, you can't just tell them the story. You also need to have that data as well. So you have to have both of those to really sort of successfully address both the believability of your point and then the emotional power of your point as well.
That's a great way to end this session. Thank you so much, Kristian, founder and CEO at Threadline. Insightful information on building relationships with our customers. I love the science and the story of that recent example.